Welcome back to HANA Basics for Developers. So in the previous video, we began to use pure Node.js as I described it. We're still only really using SAP supplied modules, libraries, functionality in the generic service implementation that uses core data and services to provide OData v4 services. Now we want to begin to see how we can write some of our own custom Node.js logic and particularly focus on RESTful services that we create from scratch using Node.js. Now in order to do this, what we want is we want to take advantage of one of the very powerful aspects of Node.js, and that's how easy it is to tap into and reuse other people's code. And the technology that makes this possible is really the concept of Node.js modules and NPN, the Node Package Manager. And this is all integrated into our environment. We've seen how we can use the package.json to reference these Node modules and a particular version, and they get pulled down and deployed when we run or install our applications. This is what we utilized earlier to get access to XSJS and XSO data. Those are simply SAP supplied modules for Node.js. But part of the power here is that we can use hundreds of thousands of existing open source modules. We don't need to reinvent the wheel. And as SAP, we don't write everything from scratch either. If you were to look inside that XSJS service, you would see many open source Node.js modules being used. And what SAP has done is we've taken a subset of the hundreds of thousands of modules that are out there, a few hundred in fact, the most common ones, the most popular ones, the ones that we wanted to use ourselves. And we've done code scans on them to make sure that they are safe. And we've actually packaged them into the HANA system. They're packaged in with the Web IDE and made them available so that even if your system doesn't have a connection to the internet, you can still access and utilize them. If you do have a connection to the internet, you can always go get even newer versions of these modules as soon as they're available. Now, a little bit later, I'll do a video that shows more about how to connect up to external NPN and how to get different versions and how we can look at the documentation and things like that. But for now, let's start simply. And just like we utilize the XSJS module, we want to use a module called Express. But the difference here is that Express isn't written by SAP or supplied by SAP. This is one of the standard Node.js open source modules. It's not part of the Node.js offering itself. It's not a built-in module. It's not provided by SAP. It's community supported, but it is very widely used in the Node.js community. It's basically like a web server. It will do all of the routing to different internal services that we were wanting to build in our application. And it's actually something that we use inside our own web module. When you pulled in the web module, the app router, it uses Express inside of it to do this internal routing that we're seeing, that we set up the rules for that route to our other services. We want to use it in our own application and do the same sort of routing. And what you're going to see is that SAP has taken our specific modules for like database access and the UAA security module, and we've made them so that they work as middleware inside of the standard open source Express module. So that's how important some of these community modules are, is that we've built even our own modules to work inside and with these other modules. And that's going to allow us to set up so that it's very easy for us to write additional little RESTful services in our application. We'll actually let Express take care of all the handling of the URLs and the requests and the response object, and it'll feel just as simple as say XSJS does when you have the $sign APIs, but not using an SAP proprietary API, but very standard Node.js concepts. All right, so let's go back to the web IDE. Let's close out our test from the previous exercise. And what we see here is originally our SRV module. It doesn't actually have a like our XSJS. We had a server.js where we did our startup. That was the first bit of code that was executed. If we look at the package.json of our SRV module, you'll see that the start script doesn't actually go to a local JS file. It instead just starts up a Node module supplied by SAP, the @SAP, but our CDS module is what is actually starting in this application. Now, the original project wizard did all of this for us. It did the setup of the package.json and the start. But what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to change this now. We could, of course, put our custom node development in a whole separate module, but we don't really need to. It can share the same module as our Core Data and Services OData service framework, and the two can exist side by side, because even this OData framework is designed to be integrated into Express as well. So why don't we go ahead and create our own new server.js file. And of course it's empty to begin with. Let's come over here and let's grab a code snippet that will fill this in. I have one. And this is going to be a pretty big code snippet, but I'll walk you through what it's doing here. Let's save that. All right, what do we see? This is actually going to be pretty similar to the server.js bootstrap that we saw here in the XSJS. We're going to use the environment module to be able to read the bindings of our bound services. And here we didn't have to do too much beyond that. We were able to then just pass that into the standard XSJS module. But over here, we're going to do similar processing, but we're going to need to initialize the CDNS OData service. We're going to need to initialize our database connection and our security, just like we did with XSJS. But then we're going to put all that inside of Express and not inside of an SAP supplied module. All right. So what we have here, we have our different modules that we're going to utilize. We are going to use an SAP module for logging, for centralized logging. We'll come back and do an exercise video on that later, but for now we just put the startup in for that. Then we need to get access to Express, so we're just going to put that in a variable. And then we start setting parameters for Express. Remember, this is like our little mini web server. So for instance, I'm going to tell it that Express can use compression. These are just other Node.js modules that are middleware that can plug into Express. It's a very common way of using Express. So there we're going to get compression, HTTP compression, and then I want to also create a security policy. So I'm loading that into Express as well. We'll come back and we'll maybe look at some of the security policy stuff later. This is where it starts to get a little bit more interesting. I want to take the UAA service, very similar that we did with the XSJS bootstrap, but now I'm going to load that and I'm going to take that and I'm going to turn that into a JUT strategy, a JSON Web Token strategy, and use another open source module called Passport. And basically, it's going to use the definition of the security that comes from our UAA, and this is the library then that is going to enforce that security. So we don't have to write libraries. SAP didn't write libraries to do that because we're using standard OAuth concepts, and the OAuth security token at this point is being transformed into a JUT token, a JSON Web Token. We can use a standard Node.js security library called Passport to enforce that. We're able to plug our SAP logging library into Express as well. Once again, we'll come back and we'll talk about logging later. And then we take our security and we plug that into Express. So now every request that comes in will be checked by this Passport security library and validated against our UAA configuration. Then we're going to load our HANA service, just like we did in the XSJS environment. And then we will take this HANA options, and we have a HANA database connectivity Node.js module. That's what this XS HDB con is. You see, it's coming from HDB EXT. That's our HANA database extended module where we do it's extended utilities to help us interact with the database. We're going to use that as a middleware inside of Express as well. And what you'll see is later, we won't have to initialize a connection to the database or the container. It will be created for us by Express. And this is pretty cool if you think about this. This is an open source module, not designed by SAP, existed before we even started writing any of our porting our environment to Node.js. Yet we can take our database connectivity library and Express will manage the connections to the HANA database. That's pretty neat. Next, we want to create an instance of CDS, so our generic service provider for OData v4. So instead of in the package.json it referring directly to SAP CDS, we're going to change that in a minute to point to server.js. So now we have to initialize that module inside of our own code. So that's what we're doing here with the CDS connect, and we give it options to tell it how to connect to the HANA database. Basically, we just tell it HANA. It's going to look up everything else from the bindings. We tell it what URL path that it should listen on, and then we tell it to serve. And we can set other parameters here. It's pointing us to where to read its CSN JSON. That's the generated configuration for our services. We can tell it what URL to listen on, where our exit handlers are going to be. We'll add those later once we do our CDS exit handlers. What we want to do upon error. In this case, we're just going to log it and then exit if we would get an error. And we tell it to run inside of app. And remember, app is our instance of Express. So once again, CDS modules are supplied by SAP, but they're designed to be integrated into Express. So we just tell it to run inside of Express as well. And we can even set up some like shortcut redirects. So if anybody goes to just the root path, that will redirect internally to our OData v4 service. And if anybody calls just plain /node, it's going to redirect to our OData service as well. And then this is a concept of Express. We can have routers, and this is just a nice best practice way of setting up reusable paths. What we'll do is we'll create different JavaScript files for each different path in the URL that we might want to handle using Express. But then we're able to start our HTTP server and basically tell it upon any request that comes in, give it to Express, our instance of Express called app, give it to Express to handle, and then it can listen on a certain port, just like we did when we started XSJS. So a lot to look at there. Don't be overwhelmed by everything. Just know, we've got 100 lines of code. This becomes our bootstrap for our Node.js, and this is the kind of thing that's kind of generic. There's nothing application specific here, so I've created many different applications, and I tend to copy around this server.js usually with little to no changes from one application to another. The real code is going to be what we're going to add here when we start creating routes. So what we want to do is, we did reference these exit handlers, and we're not ready to add them yet, but we want to go ahead and have them ready for later when we do. So let's go ahead and create a new file for those, and they're going to be in a folder called lib, and then handlers, and then a file called index.js. And we don't want to put a whole lot of code in here. We want just enough so our CDS service can start up and doesn't yell at us. But basically, we're just going to put an empty module exports. This is exporting a function so it can be called by something else. That's also a concept of Node.js. And for now, we're just going to leave it empty so that later we can come in and add some of our OData v4 service exit handlers. The next thing we need to do is start creating this. I'm sorry, I didn't want to close that. Here we reference the router. So we're telling Node.js to look for its routes in a folder called router. So let's go ahead and create that as well. So we'll come here and we'll create a new file. We'll say router index.js. And in case you haven't picked up, whenever we reference just a path here, like I'm saying, look here for router, look here for lib handlers. Well, if you have an index.js inside of a folder, that's what's automatically going to be used. So we don't need to add /index.js. If we don't add anything else, it'll automatically look for an index.js and use that. Inside this index.js, we want to begin to build our different route handlers. So I'll just steal my syntax headers that tells it that we're running Node.js and ES6, and that this is going to be strict mode JavaScript. Just setting up kind of the environment here. And then the code, we're going to use this same module exports so it can be called by Express. And our input parameters here, we're going to pass in our instance of Express, and we're going to pass in the low-level instance of the HTTP server. We don't need that yet, but I know a little bit later in our videos we are going to need that when we start doing some low-level WebSockets. So we'll go ahead and add it here in the interface. Then we'll say app use, and we give it the URL path that we want to look for. So /node. And anytime a request, an HTTP request, comes into our service that has /node in it, then we want to send that to a JavaScript library that we're going to put here in our routes folder. We're going to call this first one my node. Okay, and you'll see, and you kind of got to bear with me here, what we're going to do over the next couple of videos is we're going to add more and more URL paths, and they're going to correspond to more and more route handlers. Of course, we could dump all this in one file if we wanted to. We could put all of our route handlers and all the logic, but that wouldn't be a very good structure to our application, and that would make it very hard to maintain and troubleshoot when there are problems. It's much better if you can use a nice organizational structure like we're doing here. And actually, I messed up and put one too many brackets in there. There we are. Now we're good. So we want the handler for this first file, for this first path. So this my nodes. We're going to put all our specific route handlers in a subfolder here called routes. And this is going to be mynode.js. Now this host structure with having a router and then a subfolder with routes, it's not technically required. I could have a flatter structure. It's going to be whatever I specify here. The path, I could have named this path XYZ. It doesn't have to be named routes. But I'm just kind of following best practice, and you know, you read different things online from different people that have been doing Node.js for a long time, and they give different recommendations of just good best practices of how to structure a larger scale application. So we're trying to teach you some of that structure that comes with best practices. And as I said, we're going to build this same service out over subsequent videos, and you'll see how this is going to expand. And once we get multiple route handlers, you'll see how advantageous this is to have it structured this way. But for now, let's go into our my Node.js and let's start adding some code here. I'll bring in the same headers that we have here. Oh, and I could have brought over my use strict as well. But now I want to create a variable to hold express. Require express. And another one here for the async library, something that we'll use a little bit later as well. Require async. And here's the main structure. We'll do a module exports, and then a function. This is our main block of code here. And inside this module, we're going to put different handlers. Well, first we need to get an instance of our Express. So our app equals Express router. And I can add, I don't like that syntax warning. There's nothing we can do about that, so we'll go ahead and comment it out. Now, we want to add a route handler here. We're going to say this is just our hello world handler. So we just do app express, and then the HTTP operation that we want to listen for. Well, this is going to be a get operation, and then what subpath we want to listen on. So remember, we're already in /node. That came here from the higher level route handler. So if anybody comes in with /node, it's going to go into this code. And then if after /node we get a /hi, this is the code that will process that. And it's going to get passed in a request and response object. We'll just close that block, and this is the event handler that will respond to this. So we're just going to say response send hello world Node.js. Okay, we'll save that. And this is very much like the $ request, $ response that we had in inside our XSJS example, except, you know, XSJS is kind of handling all this routing for us behind the scenes. It always has. Here we have more low-level control, but more responsibility to handle our own routing as well. Now, the last thing we want to do here is we obviously need to adjust this package.json. So we're going to have to change the start script, but also we want to add in some more dependencies. We have Express, but I was using Passport, HTTP-EXT, so we're going to need more Node.js modules. And I've prepared a little code snippet here for all the modules that we're going to need, plus the change over to our start script. Let's put that in. Notice we have many more modules. So any module that we're going to use in our code, we have to declare it in the package.json. Otherwise, we get a syntax error. And some of these modules are going to be locally. We're already putting in some references later that we're going to need in subsequent exercises to some other open source modules. We'll utilize those later. But while we're in here editing the package.json and we know what we're eventually going to need, let's just go ahead and put them all in here. You notice the start script has now been changed to just start server.js instead of calling the CDS module directly. And with that, we're pretty much done with our coding. Let's go ahead and start the SRV module, which of course we had changes to the package.json, so it's going to have to do a full deployment. So this will take a moment. And it's finished, but I've got a syntax error. So I did something wrong here in my index. Let me go back to my code and check that. Let's see. So it's telling me require is not a function. Require. One little typo here. Instead of export, this should be exports. And that's why it was saying that require is not a function, because it didn't see any functions being exported out of here because I had export instead of exports. Oh, such a silly little error. I got it right in my Node.js, but a little typo there. So now that I've corrected that error, let's go ahead and run this again. That shouldn't have to do a full delta, a full rebuild. It should be able to use a delta. Oh, and I still have an error. Let's see what I've done now. And I found my error, my second error here. This one was a little harder to find. I had to pause the video for a second and look through here. So if it's a little jarring there, I apologize. But it's basically telling me router use requires a middleware function. It didn't like the fact that it didn't seem to still think that this was a middleware function being exported out. And it looked right at first. But what I was missing at the very end here is you have to do a return app. So coming out of the function, we have to return our instance of the app. And that's basically what this error, kind of cryptic, but it was telling me, well, I'm not seeing a middleware. I'm not seeing an instance of Express coming back up out of this function. So I don't know how to then attach this to the route here, to the /node route. It's because we were not returning it. We had all the logic in here to be a handler, but we weren't then returning the instance out of here. Now, of course, I could go back and I could edit both of these mistakes out, but I think it's actually good for you to see some of the common mistakes. And you see both of these were pretty easy mistakes that I made. A little typo on one command and forgetting to put the return in here. This is actually something that I've seen people do from time to time when they're doing the workshops in the classroom setting. So now you've seen what the error messages look like. So I'll cut it down so you don't have to sit there and watch me look for the error, but I'll leave the error in so we can all learn from it. And now that I've corrected my two typos, it starts up just fine. And we can begin testing our service. I don't need to rerun the web module. We didn't make any changes to it. I can just go ahead and open it here. And you'll see, let's make sure our XSJS still works. No reason to think that it didn't. Yes. And now let's check our OData service here as well. If I just go to /node, it does that redirect. Remember, we put that URL redirect here in the server.js, that if somebody just does a / or /node, it's going to redirect to the OData service. This is our OData v4 service. Sitting in a little bit of longer URL, we configured that, but now I can still call the OData service. It works fine. That means we didn't screw up when we added our exit handler or moved it from the package.json directly calling the CDS module. This is now running inside of Express. I can tell we're getting our correct routing here to the OData service. That's good. I didn't break anything there. And now if we change the URL to /node and /hi, we see hello world Node.js. And this is working here. Let's get this side by side here. This is working because when we went into our route processing. So any request that isn't already handled by the OData service is going to go into the Express handler that we're writing the rules for here. And we're saying if it has /node, then go into this processing routine, the my_node.js. And then we look inside of my_node.js, we're saying if it's an HTTP GET request and the rest of the URL is /hi, so /hi, then do this processing. That's how we're getting this return here. And if I would add anything else on here, if I would change this, well then that's no longer valid. Express is catching that. I have no handler for that. It's returning cannot get as an error. And I think even if I add something extra on the end here, yeah, that's going to say cannot get that as well. And as I said, this is just the start. We've created the framework. We've seen how we can use Express to link our SAP modules together with our own custom logic here. And over the subsequent videos, we're going to see how we build this out with a lot more event handlers and URL paths inside of our service.